here
Progress.
from Tu B'Av. Since this Sunday is Tu B'Av, so we're not going to have a Simcha Shiur in honor of Tu B'Av, so we have to start it earlier. So we'll do this Wednesday, the Tu B'Av Simcha Shiur. So the Rebbe begins the Farbrengen from Tafshin Mem Gimel, 1983, Tu B'Av. And he says, Inyan Am Yuchad Chamish Asar B'Av, the unique thing of the 15th of Av, Mefurish b'Mishnah, it's explicit in the Mishnah. Ubarucha Yosef b'Gemara, and at greater length in the Gemara, B'Siyum v'Chosim Masechtes Tainis, at the conclusion of the Masechta called Tainis, it says as follows, quote, Yom Tovim liYisrael Chamish Asar B'Av Chem Kippurim. There were no such Yom Tovim for Yidden like the 15th of Av and like Yom Kippur. Shebehein B'Nois Yerushalayim. That in those times the daughters of Yerushalayim, and according to another version, daughters of Yisrael, would go out and dance in the vineyards. What would they say? Bachar, lift up your eyes and see. What are you choosing for yourself? Messiah b'Mishnah, and the Mishnah concludes, V'chein hu oimer, and so it says in the pasuk, go out and see the daughters of Tzion and the king Shlomo in the crown that his mother crowned him on the day of his wedding, the day of his rejoicing of his heart. So the Mishnah goes on to explain, B'yom chasanasoi is a matan Torah, the day of his chasana, that's the giving of the Torah. Ubiyom simchas liboy, and the day of the rejoicing of his heart that's going on the building of the Beis HaMikdash will be rebuilt speedily in our days. From the time of the Mishnah that was revealed and explained this at length and on, in other words, first the Gemara explained it, and then further on, these days are remembered and they are done every single generation, and that means, like the Baal Shem Tov explains, through Niskarim, that's how Nasim, through remembering, so the things that we are remembering are occurring again. This means that every 15th of Av, annually, it's repeated and it's affected and comes about, all the matters that are connected with the 15th of Av, as they were the first time around. We shouldn't think that it was only then and now we're just celebrating something that happened in the past. It's not that way. We are actually reliving and we are drawing down again what happened before. The Rebbe goes on to say even more so, even more so, according to the command of the Torah, that we're supposed to increase and go up in holiness. Moving, it's understood, that every single year, it's added an advantage and an ascent in all the matters, the Chamish Asar B'Av of the 15th of Av. And this is despite the fact, Lamrois, Hakoil, despite despite the rule, the Achsha Dara Bitmia, that is then the generation worthy, is then the generation appropriate. So in other words, one could think that our generation, what is our generation in comparison to previous generations? Yet we say that even though our generation in comparison to previous generations might not be as great, still in all, we have the obligation to increase and go higher and higher. Okay, Meduba come upon, like we've spoken about many times. Every command in the Torah is also an empowerment. According to the rule, that Hashem does not request from the Eden only according to what their capabilities are. Moving, it's understood. When Hashem commands us to act in a particular manner, surely He already gave us, prior to this, the necessary powers and the necessary capabilities for this. Concerning our topic that we're talking about, since there's the command to increase and go up in holiness and sanctity, this includes to go up and to increase in matters of the 15th of Av from year to year. Surely, up front already we were given all the necessary powers to be able to do this ascending in holiness over previous generations. Out of joy and gladness of heart, like all matters of the service of Hashem, like it says, you served Hashem your God with joy and gladness of heart. When we do so out of joy, the avodah is in the utmost perfect state possible, not just as much as it's necessary to be, but rather we're doing it beyond the letter of the law, because the nature of joy is that it breaks through boundaries. What we said before, the that we're saying that every single year there is affected an ascent, an increase in the matters of the 15th of Av, despite the rule that is then the generation worthy. In other words, as the generations go on, we seem to be decreasing and going lower in holiness. So there's a movement of mudgish gam al pi hamshach divrei hagemara bebir shara taimim al yom tov v'chamish asur ba'av. This is understood and emphasized also according to the continuation of the Gemara in the explanation of the other reasons concerning the Yom Tov of the 15th of Av. In other words, there's what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah begins with the idea of the concept of they used to go out and dance in the vineyards, but then the Gemara speaks about all different types of joyous events that took place on the 15th of Av. And the Rebbe is going to say all these additional events add to our increase of Simcha. So we see that you can increase in joy and you can increase in the experience of the 15th of Av, even in generations that seem to be lower. So he says, in addition to the general command of increasing and going up in holiness, by first prefacing, the reasons that are brought down the Gemara, they are connected with different events that took place during different periods and eras of the Jewish people's history. Beginning from the era that the Jewish people were in the wilderness, before they entered Eretz Yisrael, until the era post the Churban, after the Churban Bayis Sheni, after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. And he's going to explain some of these things. The reason for the joy of the 15th of Av, because the day that those that were supposed to pass away in the wilderness stopped passing away because of the whole story with the spies. Skip over to the last line of the page. This took place on the 15th of Av, and usually they used to pass away on the 9th of Av, and the 15th of Av, the last year before they went into Eretz Yisrael, they stopped passing away, so they knew it was over. So this took place already in the era where the Yidden were in the wilderness. At the conclusion of the 40th year of their wilderness, before they entered Eretz Yisrael. Then afterwards, and the periods afterwards, after they entered Eretz Yisrael, and before the first Beis HaMikdash, it was added the reason that the tribes were permitted to marry each other. There was a certain period where the tribes were not allowed to marry each other, so it doesn't become a mixture of the particular lots that were apportioned for every single shevet. So therefore they had to marry only with people of their own shevet, and then on the 15th of Av, at a certain period after all the lots and all the inheritances in Eretz Yisrael were settled, so then they were permitted on the 15th of Av, even before the first Beis HaMikdash, to marry with each other. And it's also the reason that also took place on the 15th of Av, that Shevet Binyamin was at one point ostracized because of a terrible story, and they were not allowed to marry into the other Shvatim, and on the 15th of Av, they were permitted to marry again into other Shvatim as well. So that was, these two events happened before the first Beis HaMikdash. But Kufish al-Achriz, and the period following that, Bezman Bayis Rishon, the times of the first Beis HaMikdash, Noisav Atam Diyom Shebit Leisheh Ben Elo Preisdi Shahishiv Yerom Ben Avot Al Drochem Shloyal Regel. Yerom Ben Avot, he had broken away from Malchi Yehuda and made his own kingdom of Yisrael, and he felt that if the Yidden would go to Yerushalayim to be Oila Regel, so then that would damage his strength and his power, so he placed troops to block any types of being Oila Regel, and the 15th of Av was a time when this was stopped. So this was during the time of the first Beis HaMikdash. So in the meantime, we're going through different eras. The time of the Midbar, we had a joy of the 15th of Av. The time prior to the Beis HaMikdash, after they went into Eretz Yisrael, the time of the Beis HaMikdash, Ubetkufish al-Achriz, and the period following this, La'achri Churban Bayis Sheni, after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash, Nois Vatam Yom Shnitten Harugi Beis HaLekvura, was added the reason that it was the day that those that were killed in the Bar Kokhba revolt in the city of Beisar, which was his final stronghold, and the Romans didn't allow them to be buried for a long period of time, and on the 15th of Av they were finally allowed to be buried. This event took place after the destruction of the second Beis HaMikdash. We have all these different events that took place during the 15th of Av. So the Rebbe says, seemingly it's not understood. Since while the Eden were still in the wilderness, before they even entered Eretz Yisrael, it was already the 15th of Av was a day of Simcha, because of the, like we said, in the wilderness, all those that were decreed upon them to pass away because of the sin of the Meraglim, because of the spies, they stopped dying. So he said, "L'shem maz kukim l'taimim neisafim akshurim emuroi sheiru b'tkufa shel achriza." What need is there for further reasons that are connected with events that took place in periods after this one? Va'afilu l'pirish ha'mefarshim l'sheskukim l'tam noisaf k'dei levayer madua ha'tesba of yom tov gadol yosim meshar yom tovim. Even according to the explanation of the commentaries, that you know why you need to have another reason. Because we're trying to explain why does the Mishnah say that there were no other Yom Tovim like the day of Tu B'Av. Like Yom Tovim Yisrael Chamish Asar B'Av. Harimaspik Loimar based time Levad. If that's the only reason to tell us why the joy and the Yom Tov surpassed all other Yom Tovim, it's sufficient to give us two reasons. You had the reason of the wilderness and some other reason, some other event. Choose one of the other events that the Gemara enumerates. And for what reason the Gemara bring down 5 or perhaps even 6 reasons. The Rebbe says the explanation is quite simple. When there is an additional occasion and reason, an event of joy, so then the joy is even greater. Like it's simply understood, it's self-understood that there's no comparison between the joy for one thing than the joy over 5 or 6 things. Then the joy is so much greater. Then the Rebbe adds a very interesting thing that we know on both Shivasar B'Tammuz and on Tisha B'Av, 5 negative things happened. So because of the 5 negative things, we need to counter that. And we counter that with the 5 positive things that the Gemara enumerates. That's what the Rebbe says in the brackets. Let's skip over the brackets. The Nimtza comes out, from the time that the 15th of Av was established as a Yom Tov, when all the warriors, the people of Milchama age, stopped dying at the end of the 40th year of the Yidden being in the wilderness. In Mizman Lozman, from time to time, Nitvasif Mura Noisef, it's added an additional event, Shepal Ili Vaisafa B'Yom Tov Chamishav Asar B'Av, that it affected an ascent and an increase in the Yom Tov of the 15th of Av. Ad Lemura the Yom Shnitnu Harugi Beis Al Kvura, until the event that the day that those that were killed in Beisar were allowed to be buried. La'achrei Churban Bayis Sheni, after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. Sha'az nitvasva simcha b'chamishaser ba'av ba'oifen naila yoser mashahaya b'tkufa shalifnizah. Then it was added in the joy of the 15th of Av in a higher way than all the other joys that was prior to that. V'zois, and this took place, lambroi sheklolos ha'mayim d'matzah b'tkufa shalachri churban bayis sheni, despite the fact that the general state and situation and the era after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, it was a lower state than the state in the eras before that. Similar to what we said before, is then the generation worthy? So what do we see from this? This means to say, the Chamish Asar Ba'av Royim, and the 15th of Av we see B'Poyel. In actuality, Sa'inyan the Mailim B'Kodesh, the idea of ascending in holiness. Because from one period to another period, from one era to another era, Nitoisef Ma'ura Noisef was added another event. And another event, Shehevil De Safa B'Simchat Chamish Asar Ba'av, it brought about the increase in joy of the 15th of Av. So the Rebbe says, just like these individual events that occurred over so many different periods and so many different eras in Jewish history, so the same thing is V'cheinu Midei Shana B'Shana, so too. Annually, Ilui V'Safa B'Simcha the Tu Ba'av Ba'ifn the Mile of Kodesh. Every single year there's an ascent and an increase in the joy of Tu Ba'av in a way of going up and increasing in holiness. So the Rebbe says in the brackets that even though, those times we saw something, this miracle happened or that joyous event happened, now we don't see anything that should add an increase in the simcha. So we say that even though we don't see it, it's still there, just like the person that there's sometimes cases of a person experiencing a miracle and he doesn't even recognize and he doesn't even know the type of miracle they experienced. Let's skip over the brackets. I just now told you over what it says in the brackets, and later on in Ois Hey he's going to talk about this some more, this very topic. Last paragraph on the page. From this understood the great advantage and quality of the 15th of Av in this year. Tu B'Av this year is based on all the events and ascents that took place every single year, the 15th of Av. Because every single year there is the advantage of going up higher and higher. Let us I'll just summarize the next piece over here. The Rebbe explains why Al Pi Pnimis and Yom there's such a great simcha on the 15th of Av. So the Rebbe explains that the Chassidus explains, even though there were other Yomim Tovim that were on the 15th of a month. First of all, the Zohar says because it was Kayim Resira Bashlemusa, because the moon is full, and the moon is full, and since Yidden are likened to the moon, and the nations of the world are likened to the sun, so therefore, since Yidden have a connection with the moon, and it's the 15th of the month, so that is a great ascent for us. But Chassidus had asked, Pesach is also on the 15th of the month, and Sukkot is also on the 15th of the month. Why is Tu B'Av even greater than those Yom Tovim? It says, Lo Yehoyu Yom Tovim as great as it. But the explanation that Chassidus says is because since we know that every descent is for the purpose of an ascent, so therefore, since the descent of prior to those descents, even the descent of Golus Mitzrayim and the descent of Golus Mitzrayim before Pesach and before Sukkot, it's incomparable to the descent of Tisha B'Av, because that was before the giving of the Torah, and that was before there was that Hashem told Zonoich Hashem Alakecham, before He chose us as a nation, and before all the great things that took place with us being in Eretz Yisrael and having the Beis HaMikdash. So the true descent and the most terrible descent took place only after Tisha B'Av. So therefore, since the descent of Tisha B'Av is incomparable to the descent, and it's so much worse than the descent of Mitzrayim, Golus Mitzrayim, for example. So therefore, that's why the 15th of Av, which the moon is fullest, that's the counterbalance, that's the aliyah and the ascent that follows the terrible descent of Tisha B'Av. That's understood that the ascent that follows the great descent of Tisha B'Av is so much greater than the ascent of any 15th of the month, or even the 15th of the month of Pesach and Sukkot, which follow Golus Mitzrayim, which weren't such a terrible descent. Let's go on to Eis Dalet. Alpiza, move on. According to this, it's understood. Bitochon, how it makes sense. From one era to another era. Midor l'dor, from generation to generation. Mishana l'shana, from year to year. Nifol iloi v'yisafa b'simchas Tu B'Av. It's affected an ascent and an increase in the joy of Tu B'Av. Lambrois haklal da'achshir dora bitmia. Despite the rule, is then the generation worthy? Ki adrab, just the opposite. The very fact that we have a question about our worthiness, that itself is indicative of how great the ascent is, because we are so low. Migoid la'yirida gufa, from the great descent itself, muchach, we must say sha'aliyah shalachrizei boifn naila yoser, that the ascent that follows is in a much greater manner. This means to say, the descent of the exile and the destruction of second Beis HaMikdash, is even lower than the descent and the exile and destruction of first Beis HaMikdash. Despite the great descent of the Golus and the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, ad kedei kach, to such a degree we see that this destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash impacted the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. Shagam la'achri hagula begol zeh. Even after we were redeemed from the exile of the first Beis HaMikdash, which is when we were redeemed from the exile of the first Beis HaMikdash, bezman bayis sheni, in the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. Still in all, chasru hei dvarim, there were chasru chamisha dvarim, there was still 5 things lacking. There was the aron, the luchas, and there was the kapoiris lacking, and the fire coming down from heaven. There were different things that were lacking even after the second Beis HaMikdash was built. So we see how powerful the Golus of the first Beis HaMikdash is, that its impact and influence was felt even in the second Beis HaMikdash. Yet, despite that terrible thing of the Golus of the first Beis HaMikdash, it still doesn't come to the great descent that was caused through the Golus of the second Beis HaMikdash. How do you do? Yisrael. It's known about Jewish history that the state and situation of the Yidden after the destruction of second Beis HaMikdash was much worse than their state and situation during Golus Bavel after the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, even physically, because the Jewish people were treated very well in Golus Bavel. In other words, though Nebuchadnezzar was not a wonderful king, and when he destroyed the Beis Hamikdash, there was a lot of difficulty and so on. But those that were in exile in Bavel were usually relatively comfortable in exile to such a degree that when it came, the Golus Bavel was over and they built the second Beis Hamikdash, many of them didn't want to return, and a lot of them were taken into the royal house, like the story with Daniel and the other Jewish leaders that were like practically grew up in the royal palace of Nebuchadnezzar and the other kings over there. And spiritually as well, the Jewish people were on a much elevated level in and during the Golus of Bavel, the Golus after the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, over the terrible situation and the great descent and both the physical persecutions and the spiritual descent of the Jewish people after the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash. So therefore, after the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash, the descent was much, much worse than even after the destruction of the first. Since that is the case, moving it's understood Ilui, the Tu B'Av, the ascent of the 15th of Av, after the ascent of the 15th of Av, after the descent of the 9th of Av, in the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, it's in a much greater way than the ascent of the 15th of Av after the descent of Tisha B'Av in the destruction of first Beis Hamikdash. This is appropriate to and corresponding to the great difference in how the descent was. So it's understood that the 15th of Av, after the first destruction, was not as high as 15th of Av after the second destruction. And by extension, as the Golus gets worse, as the Golus gets lower, as we descend lower, so the 15th of Av must be a much higher level. In a similar vein is understood concerning the 15th of Av in the eras following the destruction of the second Beis Hamikdash, until these days. The Ikvus of the Mashiach, the double and quadruple darkness of the heels of Mashiach. Skip the brackets. Yehudi shoyel l'simcha maza oisa, or l'simcha zu maza oisa. What were you happy about? What are you being so excited about? What are you jumping for joy? Ubefrat, and especially kasher toiv memenu l'haus b'kodesh or l'hoisa b'simcha zu b'oifenayla yoisa b'simcha tu b'av. Especially when we demand from him to ascend in holiness and increase in this joy in a much higher way than the joy of Tu B'Av in the previous year, and B'Shanim Shalifnizan, the years prior to that, or B'Dairis Shalifnizan, to have a greater joy than the generations before that. Sha'az Tayanu, so the Yid says back and says, isn't it enough if I'll at least just be as happy as the previous year? Isn't it enough that I'll be as happy like my Zayda was on Tu B'Av? I have to be more than he did. What room, what place is there to say that I have to increase in joy over what I did before? I have to have more joy than my Zayda had, than my grandfather had. So we tell them, since now the descent is much lower, this itself is a proof. The ascent that will be after this great descent will be an unbelievable ascent, in the ultimate perfect state. Al derech u bedugmas klolos ha'ili de Tu B'Av legabe shar moedim, similar to the difference between Tu B'Av to other Yom Tovim. Va'ilu shenifel b'simcha de Tu B'Av lachal goyd la'yachid ha'yirida de chorban bayis sheini bi'achsel simcha de Tu B'Av lachal ha'yirida de chorban bayis sheinishin. It's similar, the difference of this year's Tu B'Av, which is after a lower state of exile, is in comparison to last year, which is not so low as this year, is like the difference of the Tu B'Av that followed the second Beis HaMikdash versus the Tu B'Av that followed the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash. So now the Rebbe is going to address the point that I mentioned before that was in the brackets. Concerning his complaint, and he's saying, the Rebbe said this in the year Tavshim Mem Gimel 1983. He doesn't see what more happened, what greater thing happened to Tu B'Av of the year Tavshim Mem Gimel, L'gabe Tu B'Av Shnas Tavshim Mem Beis, over Tu B'Av of Mem Beis. This is because the one who witnesses, who experiences a miracle, there are cases where people experience miracles that he doesn't even recognize in his own, the miracles that are taking place. I heard just before someone on Tisha B'Av, someone talking about how the Rebbe was talking about during the early 80s that the world was like trembling and shaking, and later on it was discovered that the Russians were worried that that America under Reagan was planning to attack them first, and they were ready to go ahead at a moment's notice and start a nuclear war as preventative and so on. In other words, there were so many things happening that we don't even know how we were saved from it. So the Rebbe is saying this over here. You have no idea. This was right in that period. This was 1983. The person that has the miracle occurring to them does not even know, does not even recognize that they had a miracle occur. They don't even know that there was something miraculous going on and something above and beyond nature happening over here. How do you do? So it's known, the fact that one doesn't recognize the miracle, not only does this not decrease and lessen the advantage of and the greatness of the miracle to say, well, if I don't recognize it, it's not so great. No, Ela Adra, but just the opposite. This very fact that we don't see the miracle, this proves it's such a high and powerful miracle, misuga nisim, from the category of miracles, about those miracles it says he makes great wonders for himself. What does it mean he makes it for himself? That means that only Hashem recognizes these great miracles. This means to say as follows: listen to how great the miracles are that we don't even recognize the miracles. There are the miracles that Hashem did through Moshe Rabbeinu and through prophets and through tzaddikim in every generation. Like the Alter Rebbe brings down in Tanya in Sharich Vamun. But as opposed to those that are performed by different tzaddikim and different people, there are such miracles that they are great wonders for himself. To such a degree, only Hashem alone recognizes those miracles and knows of those miracles. And the Rebbe says that this is the famous thing that we say about Purim over Pesach, that Purim is something that's not recognizable. The miracles, everything seems to be going in a natural way. So in a similar vein, when there's miracles that we don't even see and not even aware of it, so it's even greater, just like the greatness of, let's say, Purim over Pesach. We'll skip over to the third paragraph. So too concerning the 15th of Av. The very fact that we don't see the ascent that was added and increased in the 15th of Av in 1983. The one who benefits from the miracle is not recognizing the miracle that occurred. Mahava Yichacha Shezo Ili Godel B'Yoysa She'ena Yochel Is Gal Sadeiza Tam Goli. This is a proof that this is such a great ascent that it cannot become revealed through any revealed reason. Therefore, it's in a much greater way than the 15th of Av in the times of the Mishnayos and the Gemara. In the times of the Mishnah and the Gemara, the reason for the joy could be revealed, but here it's so high, it can't even be revealed. According to this, it's simply understood. What we demand from a Yid to add an increase and to ascend in holiness and the joy of Tu B'Av of this year. In a greater manner than the type of joy of the 15th of Av that he had in years and generations beforehand. We're going to skip over another piece over here to Ois Zayin. And then he says as follows: Hayom Tov, the Chamisha Asur B'Av, the Yom Tov of the 15th of Av, Einei Mefia B'Torah Shebeksav, does not appear in the written Torah. Kishara Yom Tovim, like the rest of the Yom Tovim. Sha'af Yisrael Inu the Kachinu Lizmani, even though Yidden are the ones that establish the sanctity of Yom Tovim, because Yidden are the ones that decide when, let's say, Rosh Chodesh Nisan will be, because Bezdin is the one that proclaims the first of Nisan, so therefore, by extension, that's when Pesach will come out 15 days later. And the same thing, they establish when the first of Tishrei is, so then a result of that is when Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Sukkot Torah is, and so on. So Yidden are the ones that establish Yom Tovim. But even though Yidden are the ones that establish it, the Yom Tov is rooted in Torah. Let's skip the parentheses. The command to sanctify these times is explicit in Torah. Three pilgrimage festivals you should celebrate to me in the year. The Chamisha Asur B'Av, as opposed to the Yom Tov of the 15th of Av, that was something that came about in the oral Torah through the Tanoim and the Amoraim. And then he says in the brackets, and even if you want to tell me that it was established by the Moshe Rabbeinu in the Midbar, when the Torah Shebeksav, in the times of Torah Shebeksav, but there are certain things that Moshe Rabbeinu established that is not considered part of Torah Shebal Peh. It's not written in the 5 books of the Torah. So even if Moshe Rabbeinu was the one that established the 15th of Av as a Yom Tov in the wilderness, when the generation stopped passing away in the 40th year of being in the wilderness, but it's still like other things that Moshe Rabbeinu established, that they are still part of the oral Torah. It's not written, it's not part of Torah Shebeksav. Despite the fact that it's not in the written Torah, not only do we not say that its level is somehow lower than the level of other Yom Tovim. But just the opposite. There were no Yom Tovim for the Yidden like the 15th of Av. Let's skip over a little bit to the bottom of the page. Besigna and Acher, putting this in a different way. In the 15th of Av is emphasized the advantage of our avodah. That's Torah Shebal Peh, what we have contributed. The Rebbe earlier in the Sikha, the part that we skipped, spoke about Nitzchuni, Bona Nitzchuni, how Hashem tells the Yidden that my sons, be victorious over me. He accepts their ruling, not his ruling. Only and specifically through the descent down here below. We reached a great advantage that we would not have reached if not for the descent. Like we spoke about it earlier, the advantage of the 15th of Av in comparison to other Yom Tovim is because it's after the great descent of the 9th of Av, that descent was for the sake of an ascent. It's a greater ascent than any other ascent, because it's comparable to how great the descent was, that no other time preceding no other Yom Tov was such a great descent. So therefore no other ascent of any other Yom Tov compares to the ascent of the 15th of Av. Pisa moving. According to this understood, Shemidor, from generation to generation, Meshana, Leshana, from year to year, Nifal, Ili, Veisafa, Besimcha, the Tu B'Av is affected, an advantage and an increase in the advantage of the 15th of Av. Afal Pi, though, even though we say, is it then the generation worthy of this? How can we say that we are ascending higher? So that's actually the reason why the ascent and the joy is so great. The fact that our generation has descended so much lower than previous generations, this is a proof we have to arrive at the greatest ascent, comparable and corresponding to the great descent, Kanal Baruch, like we spoke earlier at length. Since Hashem demands this from the Yidden, surely Hashem does this himself. Like it says, Hashem relates his words and his statutes and rules and laws to the Yidden, meaning that it's his because he does the same thing that he asks of us. This ascent that Hashem gives in the 15th of Av of this year will be in a much greater way than what was supposed to be appropriate and corresponding to the previous years. Action is primary. The intention of the remembrance and speaking about the matters of the 15th of Av, these days are remembered. Through that, we will accept upon ourselves good resolutions concerning action. Niskarim v'nasim. The reason for remembrance is that we should do like it says in the Megillah. First and foremost, to add an increase in Torah study, like it's emphasized in the Gemara concerning the 15th of Av, Mekan ve'elach the Moisef Yosef. From now on, whoever increases, he will be increased. To Kapirish Rashi, like Rashi explains, Mechamish also ba'av ve'elach, from the 15th of Av and on, the Moisef Leilos al Yomim, that the nights increase over the days. In other words, the days start becoming shorter. So he has to add in his Torah learning the nights also over the days. Lask b'Torah, to be involved in Torah. Yosef Chaim al Chayev. He will add and increase life over his life. Haisafa b'limud Torah, increasing in Torah study. Heim b'kamas v'heim b'echos, both in quantity and in quality. Since the greatness of learning is to bring to action, so it's not just about increasing in Torah study and that's it. But the increase and the greatness of Torah study is that it brings to action. Movements, it's understood that when a person increases in Torah learning, through this is also affected an increase also in the care and extra of that he's doing in action of mitzvahs and action. By days in the fellows, through that is affected an increase in the drawing down of the Baruch of Hashem. Yosef Chaim al Chayav, he will bring down life on his life of pashtus, and simply put, like all matters of Rashi, that it's all in the simple sense. Length of days and good years, the poil mamish in actuality, lamata masorat tfachim, below 10 hands breadth, chaim amitim al pi Torah, true life according to Torah. Torah Sam is the Torah of truth, the Torah is chaim, the Torah of life. U'mitzvah its mitzvahs aleim, number of achaybem, concerning them it says we will live in them. U'me'abracha da'arichas yamim v'shanim toivus, and from the bracha of the length of days and good years, boim bekar of mamish v'yom shekuli toiv v'yom shekuli aruch, we come speedily to the day which is entirely good and a day that's entirely long. She'oz yikuim hayid amuvim b'siyim v'sechtes tainis, then it will be fulfilled the promise, what's foretold at the end of Masechtas Tainis. V'amar b'yamahu, they will say in that day, Hine Elokeinu zeh, behold, when Mashiach comes, we will say, behold, this is our God. Kivinu loy, this is who we hoped for. V'yeshienu, and He is our salvation. Zeh havai kivinu loy, this is Hashem, who we hoped Him. Nagila v'nischa v'shuase, we will rejoice and be happy with His salvation. V'mheira v'meinu mamish, speedily in our days mamish. Begula mitzvah shleim idea Mashiach tzidkeinu, and the true and complete redemption through Mashiach.